Associate Vice President for Undergraduate Studies. That was the job title. I worked with him a lot that time. He took care of us on the administrative side. Dr. Kornfeld has his master's from Sonoma State University. Your bachelor's?
No, bachelor's in Princeton.
That's right. And his PhD from Indiana University. He is a distinguished alumni. He has a distinguished alumni award. And he is a deeply, deeply respected faculty member in the Department of Education. Please welcome Dr. John Kornfeld.
Thank you. I'm going to add a couple other things just to give myself a little bit more credibility. One is that I was a classroom teacher for 16 years. That was before I got my PhD and started teaching in the School of Education. So I've kind of had two careers, but they're very closely connected. And now the best thing Scott left out is I'm retired. I'm here half-time. I teach half-time back in the School of Education. So now you know everything you need to know about me. Let me talk about what I want to cover today. Plato's Cave, you may not have read it because you haven't even started your classes, but hopefully if you haven't read it, you will read it very soon. Because we're going to start with Plato's Cave and we're going to try to understand his vision of a worthwhile education. And then I'm going to offer an alternative model. We're going to look at schooling in the US today, and we're eventually going to get to the here and now. My goal is to get to this question. What does Plato's Cave have to do with your identity as a student at Sonoma State University? Because the title of this course is, it's not really FYE, it's Identity and Global Challenges. And you're going to spend a lot of time looking at identity from a lot of different standpoints. We're going to start off from the field of education. Okay, so if you haven't read Plato's Allegory of the Cave, this is something that I pulled off of the internet. His Allegory of the Cave comes from the Republic, which was his vision of the perfect society. And the Allegory of the Cave is actually about education, how education should work, how a teacher helps the students to learn. And it's probably the most famous thing that Plato ever wrote. So remember, an allegory is a story that serves as a symbolic representation for some truths or generalizations about human existence. But first, to understand how this allegory works, I thought I would show you a little clip from a movie where I feel the allegory is playing out. How many of you are familiar with The Matrix? Okay, The Matrix. Many of you are. I would say it's a recent movie, but it's actually like more than 20 years old. And this is basically what's going on. Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, it's a science fiction. He has some suspicions that the world around him is not what he thinks it is. And in this scene, he meets his teacher named Morpheus, who shows him the truth, that is, the way things really are. So it's about 10 minutes long, and what I'd like you to do while you're watching is think about Plato's Cave and education and the experience of the learner. Welcome to Sonoma State, right? Here we are. All right, so let's make some connections here, okay? So let's look back at Plato's Cave. How many of you have read it either in high school or you read it before this class? Oh, most of you, good. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So in Plato's Cave, this allegory, you have the learners are those prisoners who are shackled and looking at the wall. And they really don't know what's real because they've always been looking at the wall. And what they're looking at, that is what their senses tell them. That's what they think is the real world. But what they see and what they hear is just shadows and echoes created by the people behind them, and all they're just seeing these shadows in the firelight. It's two-dimensional, it's echoey. Our senses fool us rather than revealing the truth. What does Morpheus say? You're a slave born into a prison for your mind. Remember, Neo doesn't like the idea of predetermination. He wants to be in charge of his own destiny. So the teacher's job the teacher is up above the cave, and the teacher's job is to return into the cave, to unshackle the prisoners and turn them around, turn the mind around, as Plato likes to say, and show the prisoners how they've been fooled. Then the teacher takes them up to the sunlight. A student last year commented that, oh, that's what Neo's doing. He's being brought up to the sunlight, just like in Plato's Cave. And Morpheus puts it this way, you have to see it for yourself. This is an enormous transformation. It's not like when you were in school and you had a hard math problem and you said, oh, I get it now. It's really bigger. It's when the knowledge that you gain changes your whole way of thinking, rocks your worldview. So a few things to keep in mind about Plato's vision of education. First of all, it assumes that there is such a thing as truth. Not just information, but something much more profound than mere facts. Not just things that you see, but ideas that you understand. Truth is an understanding of the good, of what's real, of what's right and wrong, of how to live your life. It's not easy to get to the truth, but it's there waiting to be discovered or pointed out by the teacher. Secondly, looking into the sunlight, like taking the red pill, doesn't magically transform you and teach you the truth. It just allows you the opportunity to open your mind, as Morpheus says, right? To open your mind to seek the truth. Unfortunately, this can be really painful. Plato talks about it, and it requires a whole lot of hard work. Plato reminds us how much it would hurt your eyes to come into the daylight. And after a lifetime in the cave, just as Neo, if you know the movie, endures not just the suffering there, but throughout the movie as he comes to grips with what he finds out is reality. See, that's what taking the red pill did. That can sometimes happen when your narrow, comfortable worldview is transformed. Rumi, who was a 13th century Persian poet, said, "We must become ignorant of what we've been taught. We need to become bewildered." Thirdly, Plato didn't expect every every teacher's student to achieve this level of understanding. This is not like No Child Left Behind. Plato viewed education as a process of weeding out the less capable students. The idea was, in fact, to leave most children behind and end up with teaching just the best and the brightest. In Plato's world, these best students became the guardians of society. They became the teachers. They became the philosophers. And now a big point that I'm getting to, and that is, as the allegory implies, it's up to the teacher to show the students the truth. The teacher has the knowledge as represented by the blue and transmits it. Notice there's an arrow going from the teacher to the student, from the knowledge to the student. The student is essentially passive. Obviously, though, the student like Neo has to want to learn the truth, but he just took the red pill and he got the truth. Now, what happens is, hopefully, the result is transformation when the student's understanding of the truth mirrors the teacher's. Now, how did Plato envision the teacher showing students the truth? It's not as simple as just taking the red pill. In Plato's world, and the way he describes it in the Republic, the teacher asks the student questions. Not open-ended questions to which there are many answers, but questions that have specific correct answers that lead the learners through a logical argument to the truth. Do you know what this method of teaching is called, where the teacher asks questions and the students answer and you go back and forth? Some of you have experienced that. Well, I'll give you a hint. The teacher that he's describing, Plato's describing in the book, is Socrates. Yes, sir? That's exactly right. It was the Socratic method, this question and answer. Very good. So that's really what the Republic is. When I read it, it's an example, because it's written in question and answer, of how the teacher slowly but surely orients his students to the truth, to the light. Okay, so how might this Socratic method translate into the modern American classroom? I have a very quick example, so we'll just need lights again, and you may be also familiar with this example. And I'll turn off the sound so that it doesn't feedback.
In 1930, the Republican Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer Curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Whoa. Okay, can we hit the lights so I can see my notes? Great, okay. You know, obviously that's I stacked the deck. You know, obviously that's an example where questions and answers didn't really work. There were questions but no answers. And I argued that somehow in many American classrooms, this transmission method of instruction where the teacher conveys the knowledge directly to the student, it just doesn't make a dent in the students. There's no transformation happening here. The students really don't care, and I don't blame them. Because I believe that school learning occurs much more readily when the learners care about what they're being taught. The teacher can drag the students to the light, turn them around to the light, but they have to be willing to open their eyes. So how can a teacher get the students to care about what they're learning? Well, I want to look at another kind of learning experience. Now, what I'm going to show you isn't exactly a classroom, but it could be easily moved in the classroom. I also want to say, as I said before, Plato is probably the most important educational philosopher of his time. What I'm going to show you now is the most important educational philosopher of the 20th century. Some of you may be familiar with him. Are you familiar with Bill Watterson? Calvin and Hobbes from the 80s and 90s, and that's about it. Let me tell you what's going on. You don't have to read every word. Basically, Calvin and Hobbes discover a snake. And it's just wriggling along, and immediately they have questions. How does it move, and what does it eat, and why is it flicking its tongue out? And then the most important frame is the one that has the green around it on the right, when Calvin says to Hobbes, heck, we don't know anything about snakes. And it's not like, oh my gosh, we don't know anything about snakes, how terrible. It's like, yeah, this is an invitation. I want to learn about snakes. And so the rest of it, they talk about how, and they're going to learn more. And of course, back in those days, you just went to a book, which is what they do. Okay, thanks. But let's take this a step further. Imagine if this were in a classroom, and I've seen this done, where the teacher, maybe they're going to start a unit on reptiles, and they bring everything you can imagine, snakes and lizards and whatever other things are reptiles. Turtles? No, they're amphibians. So imagine the teachers brought all these animals in, and they're all over the room. Plus, the teachers provided books, videos, internet access, all kinds of resources, maybe some experts in the field. And the teacher says to the students, okay, you get to choose whatever you want to learn. Learn whatever you want about reptiles, and then you're going to teach us. And you can teach us however you want. So the students, they might decide to work alone, they might decide to work in pairs or in large groups, but they decide what they're going to learn, and then they learn it, and then they produce something, maybe a video, maybe a website, maybe they perform a play, write a report, build a museum, you name it, and then the knowledge gets shared. So there are a lot of different terms used to describe this kind of learning process. In the School of Education where I teach, we usually refer to it as constructivism, because the learner constructs the knowledge, him or herself, usually in collaboration with others. So Calvin, for instance, is probably going to work with Hobbes, although he's imaginary, so that's confusing in some ways. But Miller and Seller, who are sort of these old-time curriculum theorists, refer to as transaction. They talk about transmission and transaction. Now notice how the arrows in transaction now move in both directions. The learning experience can begin with the teacher showing or teaching something that interests the students, or it can begin with the students choosing what to learn. But either way, the students are engaged. They want to learn. They want to contribute to the production of new knowledge. Now, the change in color in the next step shows that the student and the knowledge are evolving together. They're influencing each other. Blue and yellow are becoming green. The student uses knowledge that he or she gets from official sources, the teacher, reputable books and websites, and so on. And that's a jumping off point to construct new ideas about the topic. Now, sometimes this learning experience results in transformation, a new way of understanding the phenomenon explored. Like I said before, transformation is not just about learning new facts or bits of information. It's about grasping big ideas and concepts. And it's not just knowledge, it's understanding. So let's say Calvin does a project on, he wants to learn about what snakes eat. But in the process of learning what snakes eat, he learns, well, they eat mice and other rodents, and then what do the rodents eat, and then what do those other things eat, what they get is, Calvin might get a whole sense of how the food chain works, and understand suddenly that, oh, if you pull one link out of that chain, the whole thing falls apart. So what might start as a report about what snakes eat turns into a whole big understanding about the ecosystem on the earth. That's transformation. But transformation, I chose the red color because it's totally unpredictable. I really saw this in a classroom where I saw the results of it, where a teacher had various reptiles and had a boa constrictor, and the boa constrictor bit a student. And it's not poisonous, but there she is with the boa flopping. And you could imagine that she had a transformative experience. Not one, I mean, I'll bet she regards snakes to this day differently than she would have if she hadn't been bit. So that's one of the things that can be quite unpredictable. So just to review again, transmission is unidirectional, and transaction goes in both directions. There's some big consequences to these differences. Or the differences are not just directional. It's really about your whole view of knowledge. So first of all, the view of your nature of knowledge is different. Transmission assumes that knowledge is fixed and absolute. It exists apart from the learner. Like Plato's truth out there in the sunlight, Neo's truth out there outside of his mind. You find this truth in books and in the minds of those who already have acquired it. The teacher has it and the students don't. Transaction assumes that knowledge is not fixed. It's tentative, it's ever-changing. People construct and then reconstruct knowledge throughout their lives. Therefore, it depends on people's experiences, their cultural backgrounds, and so on. And it's everywhere. It's not just in the books or the teacher's head. The blue bullet. In transmission views of education, the teaching event must start with the teacher or the textbook. In a transaction experience, it can start anywhere. Then the green, very important. In a transmission view of education, the learners are passive. They are just getting the elixir of knowledge poured into their heads. In a transaction view of education, the learner has to be actively involved or it's not going to happen. And finally, whatever that color is, brown, reddish, transmission is more efficient than transaction. The teacher simply gives the knowledge to the student, to the learner, and that's it. Presumably the learner learns exactly what the teacher taught, whereas transaction is potentially inefficient. The knowledge constructed could differ significantly from the teacher intended. A snake could bite the student, right? It takes time for that knowledge to be constructed. But I want to point out, messy versus efficient doesn't necessarily mean that one is bad and the other is good. In fact, those who favor a transaction view of learning would say that, well, since knowledge is messy, learning has to be messy or it's not going to happen. So again, just to remind you, either type of learning experience should ideally end up with transformation, when the students see the world in new and different ways. Right now, I'm transmitting knowledge to you, and I'm hoping that what I'm saying is going to transform your thinking. I'm hoping that you're connecting it to things that you did in school and realizing, oh, that's why this was a really amazing teacher and this wasn't, or that's why this was an amazing experience that I still remember. So I'm hoping you're making those connections, light bulbs are going on, but I don't really know. I mean, you could be thinking about what's for lunch, you could be sneaking a text on your phone even though you're not supposed to, and I wouldn't know because I'm trying to be efficient and transmit the knowledge. I think it's difficult to pull that off every day. But either way, in both cases, transmission or transaction, the learner has to care about what they're learning. But how do you get them to care? So I maintain that the more they are involved in the construction of knowledge, like Calvin and Hobbes are, rather than being expected to passively absorb it and consume it, the better the likelihood that they'll care about what they're learning. Now, gaining knowledge and caring about it is just the start. Knowing and caring should lead to action. What the learner does with the knowledge for him or herself, for the community, for the world, that's ultimately what the goal of education should be. And you're going to find out that's really what the goal of FYE is. Who am I as a learner? What's going on in the world that I can have an impact on? And what can I do? All right, let's fast forward to modern times. In many ways, the conception of formal education is still very much based on Plato's vision. In another chapter of the Republic, Plato describes how the young learners have to study specific subjects, stories, poetry, music, chosen by the philosophers that instill the proper moral and social values. Older students, they added more subjects, math and so on, rhetoric. This was the origin of the notion of what was called liberal education, as opposed to vocational, that by studying great books in various subjects and engaging in deep philosophical conversations, the students would gradually be brought to the sunlight. Learning to actually do something was left to the lower classes in Plato's society. All that was needed for philosopher kings was to go on this intellectual journey and ascertain the truth. This is where the notion of general education, GE, comes from, that you've heard so much about in the last few weeks, that you need to be well-rounded intellectually to complete your education. Now, today, as in Plato's time, knowledge is divided into various categories or subjects to be taught. And in each of the required courses, there's a predetermined list of information and skills that students are expected to acquire. What students are taught is called the curriculum. And here's a basic definition of curriculum, and also the subjects that you were expected to learn in school, and 60 years earlier, I was expected to learn in school. It hasn't changed much since really for 100 years. But there are still profound differences between Plato's vision of education and the realities of schooling in the 21st century. First of all, the Republic doesn't concern itself with the education of most children in Athens. It doesn't concern itself with the craftspeople or the workers who were probably apprenticed, or I don't actually know how they were prepared for their work. And anyway, Athens was a pretty small place back then. I mean, here's a picture of Plato with his students. It's like Plato and, 3 or 4 or 5 people. So for Socrates and Plato, the dissemination of the required knowledge was pretty simple. You started with the philosopher, who was the teacher, and that person transmitted the knowledge directly to the student. And I thought I hit this, but maybe I didn't. Okay, directly to the student. Now today, things have gotten a lot more complex. There are a whole lot more students to account for. We're talking about millions of students in this country. And as I already said, unlike in Plato's time, schools are expected to successfully transmit the knowledge to every student. So the dissemination of the curriculum, the knowledge that everyone is expected to know, is a lot more involved. The ideas about what should be taught start high in the government, not with philosophers, in fact, not with teachers at all, but with elected and appointed officials who develop curriculum guidelines, or standards, as they're called, that reflect the values of society as a whole. These guidelines pass through a series of bureaucratic levels, becoming ever more specific until they reach the teacher and the student at the bottom of the food chain. Although if you pulled something out of that food chain, I don't think it would matter. But at the bottom of the food chain, where the educational experience is expected to directly reflect the ideas that came down from the top. And to make sure that those ideas, that information has been taught, students are given standardized tests that are evaluated somewhere near the top. And now with Common Core, they've even added another level, which is the federal government. So what impact does this have on schools? On the schools that you all attended, that I attended? This is the kind of thing that I really like to study, because in addition to teaching in the School of Education, I get to study things about schooling as well. And in the time remaining, we can only touch on a few issues. The main thing to consider is what is required of any institution that has to process huge numbers of people. All right, let me draw an analogy. Imagine a craftsperson who makes violins. Each one is made from start to finish. Each piece is carefully fitted together. Each is unique. Each takes a long time to make, but in the end, each is beautiful and produces a superior tone. But what if you needed to produce millions of violins? What would you have to do? Well, you'd have to develop a method for mass producing them. Machines would make the back, the fingerboard, the scrolls. Parts would be fitted together as they came down the assembly line. You wouldn't have such a great product, but you'd have a lot of them, and in the shortest possible time. It would be done efficiently. There's no room for messiness when you need 1 million violins. Do you see where I'm going with this? This is the challenge that educators faced in the beginning of the 20th century. Schools were growing. The immigrant population was booming, and people from the country were moving to the cities to work in the factories. For educators, the question was, how can we keep the kids off the street, make sure they all learn to read and write, and especially learn American values? Well, with the amazing success of the Industrial Revolution, the solution was obvious. Model schools on factories. This was cutting-edge thinking in the 1920s. The student entering into kindergarten is the raw materials. The student completing school at the end and graduating is the finished product. All you had to do was figure out what that end product needed to know, divide the knowledge into its constituent parts, and move the student along the assembly line. That's where the idea of switching classes came from. They didn't do that before the 1900s. The idea of bells, how many of you have read Little House on the Prairie, all of those books? Probably nobody anymore. Well, it's the one-room schoolhouse. That was gone in the early 1900s. And so that's where the idea of switching classes came from. and bells dividing up the day. In fact, schools were even built to look like factories, homages to this system of education. These are all back east and in the Midwest because most of the schools in the West are more recent than this era, the early 1900s. So today, schools combine Plato's idea of a liberal education with this industrial model. But I don't think Plato would approve of the way it's evolved. Gone is the search for truth and beauty and transformation. So you need to erase this vision of a handful of students discussing philosophy at the feet of their mentors. You need to give up the notion of a transformative experience. The number of students to be pushed through the system necessitates an emphasis on facts and basic skills that can be taught efficiently. Quality control is assured through machine-scored fill-in-the-bubble standardized tests. I love this picture of a standardized test. This is like a standardized test on steroids. And I actually know my nephew is actually in that picture. Because it reminds me so much of this picture of a fountain pen factory from the 1850s. So what's been the impact of this factory model on all of us who are the products of this system? 13 years in school teaches us a lot more than the formal curriculum of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's something called the hidden curriculum that curriculum theorists like to talk about that can have a much greater impact than the formal curriculum. The atmosphere of the school and the way we're treated teaches us a lot about ourselves and our relationship to the knowledge we're being taught. Let's take my own schooling as an example. My mother kept everything, including my report cards. And so what you're looking at here is, in fact, my report card from kindergarten, 1958. It was a long time ago. But it's useful to examine an artifact. You need to know that an S was the highest grade, okay? Just so you know. I had trouble keeping my hands to myself, okay? I've learned. But anyway, that was my report card. But they actually show you what you get graded on is what matters, right? So look at what I was grading on. And what was expected of me? Anyone? What was expected of me? What are some of the things I'm getting graded on? Can you read it? Yes. Being able to communicate. Was that in there? Oh, contributes. Good. That's a good one. I forgot about that one. Anything else? Yes.
Being able to relax and rest on.
Yeah, I love that. You know, you're only in kindergarten for 2 hours and you had to spend like 45 minutes lying on a mat. Kindergarten has changed. That has changed. And, you know, I mean, helps keep room in order, works and plays with group, follows direction. I don't see anything. Do you see anything about like reading or anything like that? That wasn't actually there. See, what I learned in kindergarten was how to behave, right? I learned to be quiet unless spoken to, sit still until released, do what you're told, line up, follow directions, everything has a place, and so on. Raise your hand to go to the bathroom. This was the official curriculum. But what was the hidden curriculum? Basically, I learned to conform. Stay invisible, don't make waves, do what you're told, shut up. Nobody actually said to me, John, your ideas and feelings don't matter nearly as much as moving along that assembly line, but that's one of the things that I learned. That's one of the things that you learned. Because here's a more recent report card. This is from the late 90s. So it shows that the situation hasn't really changed. It's only become more intense. If you look, the social skills are in the upper left-hand corner, and they're essentially the same, except there's one that says, like, enjoys being in school. You will enjoy being in school. I always like that one. But now you've got all those other things. You've got skills in reading, writing, and math that have been added. Each of the categories represents a standard that came down from the state government and has to be met. What it takes to read, write, and do math have been broken down into tiny steps along that learning assembly line. I looked hard for transformation, but it's not listed there. And I actually can't imagine how it could happen when you've got to get through all of this. But again, the hidden curriculum is teaching students to be passive, to conform. Knowledge originates from the teacher. In fact, transformation might be undesirable. It causes discontent. It causes stress. It causes change. You can't have bewilderment. That's going to interfere with the efficient function of a large institution. There isn't time to go over this one. This is high school. Does anybody know what this is? Anyone? It wasn't mine. Yes? it's a referral. You don't recognize it. You just figured it out, right? You've never gotten one. Yeah, and you see it checked off insubordination minor, and then it said horseplay at lunch. So you know, or something like that. But I want to make a point. I'm not trying to blame the teachers. I'm not blaming administrators. I'm not blaming the students. The hidden curriculum that we learn is fostered by the institution itself. Think about the enormity of the tasks that schools face. I love to go into schools. I spend time there, and my favorite time to go is at lunch, because that's when the kids really are the kids. They're all like, imagine a high school lunch court where just everybody's out and they're talking and they're laughing and they're punching each other and, you know, flirting and making out and sneaking off to smoke and doing all this stuff. And then what happens? The bell rings. And I'm standing there, and within 5 minutes, I'm alone. Every one of those 2,000 students have gone off somewhere, into a room. They all knew exactly where. It's like a science fiction movie. The bell rings, blank look on your face. With the glaze, you walk into the next classroom. But on the other hand, what would happen if the students could do whatever they wanted? You'd have chaos. If you're going to have huge schools, you've got to condition everyone to move when they need to move, go where they need to go. Think about, though, what it took to train everyone to respond to bells like that. And that training began in kindergartens like yours and like mine. And the conformity is not just in terms of behavior. Colleges expect certain subjects to be learned. Standardized tests require that specific knowledge be learned. No Child Left Behind for many years demanded that the students learn it, or else the schools would be punished. So, in the end, what have you got? What's the effect on the student? Well, you see Calvin suffering through his day. And, you know, I know it's not so bad for some people. Not everyone hates school like Calvin. In fact, I didn't hate school. I loved it. I really did. And today, when I go out into schools, I see teachers everywhere who, in spite of standardization of curriculum and seeing 150 students a day, close their doors and foster a learning environment that is humane and engaging and transformational. And you might be thinking also, well, what does this have to do with me? I'm in college now. I'm not in high school. I finished my K-12 education. I'm done with that. Everything is going to be different now, right? Maybe. But it's possible that the hidden curriculum had a greater impact on you and on me than we realize. Sitting here in this classroom, you're the survivors of this system. Not only did you survive, you flourished within it. If you didn't, you never would have graduated and you wouldn't have ended up at a great institution like this. You learned to do what you were told. You learned to demonstrate what you know. You learned that knowledge is a commodity, something that you trade for good grades, for a diploma, and a good job. But for many of us, seeking transformation through the pursuit of knowledge may be something that we forgot long ago, sometime in elementary school. In the 21st century, to know is no longer followed by to care or to act. See, public universities like this one have some of the same downsides. Is anybody familiar with that? That's the GE pattern. You've already been told these are the things that you need to do. You need to take one from column A, one from more than one, right? You're being told all the things. You're being told these are the things you need to do. You've discovered that there are many hoops that students need to jump through. It's often safest to just let your education happen to you, like Calvin in that comic. To think of education as something merely to be endured. Do what you're told, fulfill all your requirements, get good grades, graduate, get a good job. And you may not be as familiar with this. It's a wonderful tool that's in my SSU. The ARR, Academic Requirements Report, tells you what requirements you've met, what requirements you haven't met. If you're not familiar with it, you should find it on my SSU. You've got mostly reds now and a few yellows. But the thing is, when all the greens line up, bam, you graduate. It's, think about that. Assembly line, right? Bam, 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 done, out. So with all of that, it's easy to forget that one of the major purposes of your education is not just to get a good job, although obviously that is important, but also to bewilder you, to shake the foundations of your worldview, to challenge yourself to consider new ways to think and decide what to do with the new knowledge that you attain, to know, to care, and to act. Okay, I want to conclude, and this is maybe the most important part of the lecture. See, I think Plato got it right with his cave allegory that education should be transformational. But he left something out. For learning to be meaningful, you, the learner, have to take charge of your education. Now, some of you already, like Neo, have taken the red pill. You've leaped down the rabbit hole, and now you are bewildered. And that's fine as you negotiate the new worlds you're encountering here. Others of you may be a little bit nervous about doing this. But I'm hoping that all of you in this room will take this leap into the unknown, but you may not know how to do it. Well, here are just a few things that you can do, and I know your instructors are going to talk about more. You're going to discuss more in your small groups. First of all, find something you're passionate learning about and pursue it. One way to do this might be to open your mind about topics addressed this coming year in 150. You're going to hear from many scholars who are experts in their field who will share their intellectual passions. If a lecture that you hear by a particular professor really excites you or moves you, find that person, talk to him or her. Find out what other courses you might take that would further your knowledge in that area. Like Calvin in that comic, ask questions if you don't understand. Not understanding is something to get excited about, not something to be upset about. Secondly, seek professors who will challenge you to construct new meanings with the knowledge they share. How many of you are familiar with ratemyprofessor.com? Great website. Students often use it to find the easiest professors. No, use it to find the professors who are really going to work you, but who will work you in a direction that is really meaningful and exciting to you intellectually. Look how hard Neo had to work, if you know the movie, to become the one, right? And remember that there's more to your education than the ARR, the Academic Requirements Report. That's important, but education is not just a bunch of boxes. It might be, but it can also be so much more. And find like-minded students to accompany you on this journey because, and you already have, you're here in FYE. That's why you're here. And finally, one shameless plug, and that is consider becoming a teacher. We need more Morpheuses out there who are going to challenge the system and their students and help to transform understanding around them. So that's it. In my hand, I've got a red pill and a blue pill. I hope as you begin your college education, every one of you is going to swallow the red one. So good luck in your Sonoma State career. Thank you for your attention. Have a great day.